First of all, I feel very fortunate to be the last one speaking, except for Virginia at the very end. And I want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here to share with you. It's not always an easy thing to be able to say something relevant, but it's always an easy thing to let the Spirit of God, I think, speak. And so I feel always a great pleasure and fulfillment in being able to do that. And I hope that through the messages that you've heard through this week have been relevant for you and speak to you in a special way, and that the Spirit continues to work on all of us as we try to do that. It takes a lot of effort. I help with the planning of the Christian Heritage Conference that Frank runs. But anyway, I know. There's a committee, and I know how much effort that goes into putting this all together. And so I appreciate all the people that work in the backgrounds, and Jean, what she does in the kitchen, and all the workers and the volunteers that help, and just appreciate all of you. And I can't even begin to mention name by name all those. Jesse and what he does with the technology in here, plus everything else he does on campus. Jean and Leroy, we all know about. Lauren, the singing, and just everything else. And so I want to thank, if you've had a part in doing something to make this week happen, I appreciate it. And I think all of us here that have enjoyed it, thank you as well for what you've done. And then I thank DH for giving me the opportunity to share this with him. And I think the reason, I always thought the reason he asked me to come was to make sure he looked good, and that make sure that he had somebody that wasn't quite as knowledgeable about things, and so he could correct us. But then he allowed me to be the last one up here, so. I also thought it was interesting that all the people from Turner, where he was pastor at the Turner Christian Church, didn't show up until after he was done with all of his talks. I thought that was very interesting. But I don't know if I want to take anything from that, but, draw conclusions. This morning, as we conclude our conference, we're going to come across what I consider probably one of the more puzzling and probably most misunderstood parables that Jesus tells. Because when we read this parable, we can't quite figure out sometimes what Jesus is saying in this parable. And the thing that makes it really hard is because oftentimes we take parables, as we talked about this morning, and try to make them an allegory. And if you start doing that with this parable, you're going to get in a real big mess. I'm just going to tell you. And so when we read this parable, we try to figure out, is Jesus commending cheating and being dishonest? Is he trying to say, just go ahead and manipulate others in order to get yourself a good place in the end? And does it mean that we just justify whatever we do in order to do a good thing? So let's look at the parable. It's in Luke chapter 16. He says to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him, and he said to him, what is this I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. Now, if you try to take this parable and make it an allegory, all right, who's the master? You know, is that Jesus? Is that God? Who's the manager? Is that us? And then if that's the case, then is God commending us for doing a dishonest thing here? And why is the master even commending this manager who has been dishonest, wasteful, who's going to lose his job? Why is it commend him for being shrewd? And what does that all mean anyway? So as you read through this parable, you get up a lot of these questions. And we kind of wonder, what's going on? And I don't know how many times you've ever heard a sermon about this parable. And the reason we don't is because we don't know what to do with it, you know? And we're afraid everybody's going to misunderstand whatever we say about it anyway. So, but we get a little bit of a background here and understanding that this is a manager, he's a steward, he's been placed in a position of responsibility for his master. He's going to lose it. He's not been a good manager. He's been wasteful in that. Why doesn't the master just fire him right then and there? I mean, honestly, that's what good business practice is. You don't allow a manager to stay in a position once you fired him or let him know that you're going to take him. You take the keys right away and you walk him out to the door. And why does this steward go around and start asking people, how much do you owe? Doesn't he know? Doesn't he know already? He has the records. Does he want to implicate the tenants as well? Does he want to get them to kind of be a part of this? You write it down that you only owe 50, you only owe 80. And then why does the master in the end commend his steward at all? Why isn't he upset? Why does he say, oh man, you did a great thing? And you know, did he do a great thing? Is that what he's saying here? So again, this parable just confuses us, right? Yeah. So I think to really truly understand it, we can't leave the parable there because Jesus goes on to explain the parable. Jesus talks about it, and so he explains to us what this parable means. Verse 8, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. The sons of this age are shrewd in the way that they deal with the worldly wealth. And Jesus says, you do well to listen and see what they're doing and how they use that wealth for their benefit in this world. They know how to use the wealth in this world for their benefit. Sons of light, they need to learn about this. Shrewd means being prudent. They are prudent. They thought about this. It's not commending. He doesn't commend. The master does not commend for the dishonesty, for the cheating. He just says, you know, you saw your situation. You were prudent about what you wanted to do and your future prospects. You used what you could right at the moment to make sure you had a soft landing. What does this mean to us? What is Jesus saying to us? What are we to emulate here? What are we supposed to model ourselves after here? Jesus says to his disciples in Matthew 10:16, he says, behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. I'm sending you out in a world that's ready to devour you. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Be wise as serpents, but innocent as doves. Take that innocence with you wherever you go, but be shrewd, be prudent. So let's understand what the steward did here, this manager. He saw his situation very clearly, didn't he? He knew he was losing his job. He knew that he was going to be put out on the street, and he understood clearly what his prospects were. I'm not going to dig for a living. I got to figure out a way that I can have a soft landing, and I have a place, and I'm prepared for that. And so he takes what he can, and even what he shouldn't, right? In order to ensure that his future is going to be more secure. He understood his situation. And I wonder if we understand our situation. Do you understand the situation that we are all in? Clearly. That we're here for only a period of time in this world. And that there is eternity that we are to prepare ourselves for. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 5:10, he says, we all must appear before the judgment seat of Christ so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. We're all going to stand before the judgment seat. Now, we understand grace. And we understand that God's forgiven and that we have by faith that God is going to take us into eternity. And we're going to be in heaven. But there also seems to be some kind of an accounting that goes on. He who has been entrusted with much will be, who has done well with much, will be entrusted with more. Parable of the talents. You've done well with 10,000. I'm going to give you 10,000 more. You've done well with 5,000. I'm going to give you 5,000 more. There seems to be some kind of accounting that takes place for what we have done. And so have we understood that? Do we truly believe that? And if we truly believe that, if God is God and Jesus is God in the flesh, and he says these things, do we not want to prepare ourselves and do everything within our power to make sure that when we go into eternal glory and we stand before that judgment seat, we can say with confidence, yeah, I did all these things that I could, everything I could for the benefit of your kingdom. Listen to what else Jesus says about this parable. Because he says this in verse 10. Then he follows this up. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you with the true riches? If you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you which is your own? No servant can serve two masters. For he will either hate the one or love the other, and he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. What's it going to be, Jesus says? Do you understand your situation as the steward in this parable understood his situation? Are you committed to this, or are you playing both sides of the fence? I got to prepare for my future here on earth. I got to prepare for my future in heaven. Which is it going to be? Is it my retirement here that I want to make sure is secure, or is it my retirement in heaven that I want to make secure? And as long as we are being divided in this thinking about where am I going to rest myself. And see, this is it. We prepare for this world. We want to prepare for our retirement. We want to make sure that we have security in our final days. And we forget these are not our final days. But we get caught up into that thinking. I love this whole chapter because he begins with this parable, and it all relates. He ends this chapter with another parable, starting in verse 19. There is a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, who feasted sumptuously every day, and at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with that which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried, and in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and he saw Abraham far off and Lazarus by his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you're in anguish. And besides all of this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to there, from here to you, may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. And then he said, Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. And he said to them, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. This is the only parable, by the way, and D.H. mentioned this is the very first night, that has a name, Lazarus, in the middle of this parable, main characters. And so there are those that think, well, is this a parable or is it a real life incident? Is Jesus kind of having a picture here and he's revealing something behind the curtain kind of thing? Is this a true incident that he's referring to? But I want to stick to the main point. The main point is, what are you doing with your worldly wealth? See, this parable fits in with the first parable. What are you doing to ensure your eternity? Are you so caught up into the things of this world that you haven't prepared for the next, for eternity? Riches in this life mean nothing in the next life if you have not used them to prepare yourself for that eternal destination. Hoarding here does get you nothing in heaven. Denise read this earlier in her meditation, and it fits in so much. This is what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal, for where your treasure is, there will be your heart also. You know, we look at that verse and we think, oh, that's just great. You know, I'll just lay up my treasures. And we think about spiritual treasures and we think about where our heart is and where our focus is. But if you understand this now in relationship to what Jesus has just said in these parables, you understand he's talking about our earthly treasures. And what have you used your earthly treasures for? God has given us resources. What are you using them for? Are you using them for your benefit or for the benefit of his kingdom? What was it that he said about the first parable? You use your wealth in order to make eternal friends. to make eternal friends, so that you, when you are welcomed into the kingdom, you've already prepared the way for having friends up there. This is what you use them for. God has granted us a lot of resources. It's not just material blessings that He's given us. He's given us spiritual blessings. Do you hoard those? He's given us time. He's given us spiritual gifts. What are you using them for? Are you using them to create eternal friends? Eternal friends. D.H. referred to this earlier in the parable of the sheep and the goats, Matthew 25. And this again relates to, what are you using your stuff for? At that point, in verse 37, then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, and thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer to them, truly, I say to you, when you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. Make no mistake. What you have been entrusted with in this world is to be used, Jesus says, to build eternal friends, to prepare for eternity. Paul writes to Timothy, and he says, we brought nothing into this world. We're not going to take anything out of this world. Everything that you have been given has been given to you and entrusted to you for a purpose. And it's not about making sure that I can live tomorrow and that I have a safe place to land tomorrow and I've taken care of my future here on earth tomorrow. It is to ensure that I have used it for God's glory and for His kingdom going forward. That I have made eternal friends. This is troubling. I got to tell you, this is hard for me. What about the homeless? What about the people we see along the street? Went into Lincoln City yesterday, and they're even here. You know, they're along the street, and they got their signs up. And how do you deal with this? Cheryl and I are really struggling right now because there's someone who is just laying the guilt upon us. You have more than you need, and I have nothing, and I need a lot. And God wants you to share that with me. And is using everything in their power to try to make us feel guilty about this. And then I come across scriptures like this, and I'm thinking, I got to make an eternal friend here. But then I think, am I enabling? And I could come up with a lot of excuses, right? Why I shouldn't. And whether I'm doing more harm than good. This is hard for us. This is not an easy thing. And God doesn't want us. He places in a responsibility. We're stewards. We are created to be stewards of His creation. And yes, it's all God's to begin with, but He entrusts us with that. So He doesn't, I don't believe, He doesn't want us to go out and make ourselves destitute so that we're beggars, expecting somebody to give us a handout in order for that I can exist. Is this socialism? Do we just put all of our things in the one place, and we read that in Acts, that they all came together and nobody in the church was without need? Is that some kind of form of socialism that we're talking about here? I mean, that really goes against our American way of thinking. What does it mean when we take that which God has entrusted us And how do we put that into practice? Between these two parables, Luke seems to go off in a completely different direction. It's really kind of interesting. So usually you don't see these two parables kind of necessarily be put together, and especially with the scriptures, the verses that are in between them. So I want to back up. At the end of the first parable, and his explanation of what goes on in that very first parable, he says this. There are the Pharisees that are there, and this is back in verse 14. He says the Pharisees that were there, who were lovers of money, they heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. And he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. The law and the prophets were until John. Since then, the good news of the kingdom of God is preached, and everyone forces his way into it. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void." What does that mean with everything else that we just talked about? How does that even relate? So, we usually just read that separately, and we don't really necessarily include it with the parable, right? But it all relates, doesn't it? Here are the Pharisees, they're listening to what Jesus is talking about, using unrighteous wealth and being shrewd in the way and planning for an eternal future. And they're ridiculing, they're scoffing him. You're nuts, Jesus. And Jesus looks back at him and says, "You know what? You got your reward here. This is what you've done. You've taken what has been entrusted to you, and all you've done is hoard it for yourselves. You have justified yourselves before men. God knows what's in your heart. He knows that all you want is to gather more stuff in this world. You want to gain the praise and the fame of being a Pharisee in this world. And you want people to respect you for everything. And you know what? You got your reward. The law and the prophets come in. They prepared you for this moment. But what have you done? You prepared yourselves for this moment. We all know that the gospel's been used this way, right? We know of those that have taken the gospel and they've used the gospel for their own building up of fame and glory in this world. Pastors who are only in it for the paycheck, who are only concerned about getting the money at the end of the day so they can go home and feed their families. All the laws and the prophets spoke of God's grace and his eternal ramifications for our life here on earth. And the good news now comes in the form of Jesus. He is the embodiment of God's grace. And he tells the Pharisees, you've missed the point. Man cannot beat himself into the door, beat down the door into heaven and expect to gain entry. All that they have expected now, all that they have wanted, everything that they have achieved in this world has been for nothing because they've kept it to themselves. Paul writes about this he talks about his people, the Israelites, and he talks about how his heart breaks for them because they missed the whole point in Romans chapters 9 through 11. And he says in verse 4 of chapter 9, he says, they are the Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. To them belong all the patriarchs. And from their race, according to the flesh, is the Christ, who is God over all, blessed forever. They had everything. God gave them everything. You are my chosen people, not because you did anything special, but because I chose you, in order that through you I may show the rest of the world my grace. That no matter how bad you are, and you've been pretty bad, I'm going to restore you. I'm going to show what it means that I am a faithful God, that I created a covenant with you. You've had all this advantage given to you. What have you done with it? What have you used it for? The Jews had all of these blessings, and yet the majority of them refused to accept Jesus when he came. See, but wait, there's more. Because after he says this, there's one verse before he goes into the parable of Lazarus. And it's like, what is this verse doing here? Verse 18. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. Luke, why'd you put this in here? Did Jesus actually say this in this moment? Really? What's this got to do with anything here, what we're talking about? And yet I think this verse is the linchpin that connects it all together. You don't have a way out. You have got to be totally committed. God has told his people time and time again through the prophets, this is a relationship, this is a covenant that I have with you. I am like the bridegroom, you are the bride. And you've gone off and you've committed adultery time and time again, he tells them. This has been the message all through the Old Testament. Read Ezekiel, read Hosea, read the prophets. You broke this relationship. And so right here, in the midst of all this about what you're here on earth to do, what you're to do with all your earthly possessions, your worldly wealth, and everything else that God has given you, he says this. You don't have a way out. When you go into this relationship, you got to be committed. You got to be all in. There's no escape clause here. This is a relationship you're involved in. And when he talks about that, he's talking like what Cortez did to the boats, right? When he came across and he wanted to fight the Aztecs and he didn't want his men to think they had an escape route. And so he burned the boats. So that you got to stay. You're committed to this. Marriage is like that. This is what God intended with this covenant relationship that he has between a man and a woman. This is what he intended. And he intended that it would be a mirror of the relationship that he has with us. And yes, we have brokenness in this world. We have brokenness in this world. But we have to understand that God's intention for us is in our relationship with him. And I'm talking about this verse in relationship to our relationship with him. That marriage relationship we have with him. That covenant relationship we have with him. Are we committed to him? Are we all in? See, you take this whole chapter now, Luke 16, and you kind of understand what he's talking about. And now you understand the rich young ruler, right? And you know what? I'm sorry, I got my priorities in two different places, the rich young ruler, as he walks away, because he's got too much stuff to get rid of. I can't follow Jesus. You got to be all in. You got to sell everything. You got to give it all away and follow me. And he goes away sad. I can't do that. Serving two masters. It's what we are here for. Do we believe what we believe? Honestly, do we act like we believe what we believe? Paul writes it this way in 1 Corinthians 9. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews, I became a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win then those that are under the law. And to those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, in order that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. He's talking about his eternal blessings. He's making eternal friends here. I do it all for them. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So do I run aimlessly? I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Are you all in, Paul says? I'm all in. I don't do this without thinking about that prize. I have a good friend back in Tennessee. He was a basketball coach, became the athletic director of the high school that he was at there. Good friend, Sunday school teacher, leader in our church. And I would play fantasy baseball. I don't know how many of you ever heard of that, but you get into baseball and you really start getting to know the numbers. And I finally had to quit because I knew more about baseball and statistics than I ought to know, than anybody ought to know, and probably more than I knew about Scripture at that point. And he got involved. And he was like ruthless in this. And I'm saying, the rest of us were just kind of having fun here. We're just, and he told me this. He says, you know what, I went to my wife's office party. He was, again, very competitive. And she worked for an insurance company. And they had this little backyard game. And they were playing volleyball. And, everybody's having a good time until he starts playing. And then it's spiking the ball, and he broke somebody's nose. I don't know, got a bloody nose. Anyway, one of the workers there. And his wife took him aside, going, what are you doing, He says, and he tells me this, he says, I don't play anything to come in second. I don't play anything to come in second. And I go back to this verse that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. I don't play anything to come in second, Paul says. I'm playing in order to win the prize. I'm using every resource that I have. To the weak, I'm going to become weak. To those that are outside the law, even though I understand that I'm under the law of Christ, I'm going to live like them in order that I might win some of them. I'm going to make eternal friends. I'm going to take everything that God has given me in order to make eternal wins. I am all in. I'm all in on this. I'm committed to this. There's no out for me. I know where my eternity is. And I'm going to use every moment that I have here on earth to ensure that I take with me eternal friends. This whole week we've talked about stories. D.H. talked on the first night that it's these parables, they're just thrown alongside. Right? Parable, to throw alongside. Our stories are alongside the story of God. We throw all of our stories together, and it's just part of the fabric, the weaving together of all of our stories that make up Jesus' story, God's story here on earth. And it begins with our trust and our belief and our faith in God, the Almighty One, trusting ourselves into His care and His provision for us, that He takes that which is just us and He weaves it in and He grows this great big mustard tree that the birds of the air can come and nest in. It's a story of our involvement in the world and the evil that we see and we experience in this world, and the trust that we have that God will set it all right in the end. But we have to be involved in that, and we've got to be salt and we've got to be light. It's the story of brokenness and recognizing that we are broken people and we need God's forgiveness. And we need to show that forgiveness to each other and to others that may not need that and don't deserve it. But we've received it from God. Therefore, we offer that grace to them as well. It's a story of understanding our need to adapt to the ways of new and younger generations that are growing up around us without devaluing or diluting that message that we bring. And as D.H. emphasized last night, God needs us. He needs our story. He needs our story to tell His story. He's not done with you yet. You're still here. He's not done with me. He's given us the resources of our time and our experience and our wealth in this life. What are you doing with that? What are you doing with what you have right now? It's not too late to be all in. It's not too late to be sitting around that table right now and putting all your chips there in the center and saying, God, I trust you. I'm doing this for your kingdom, for your glory. I want to be committed today. And that's the question that I want to leave you with as you leave this place and this time. Are you willing to be that living sacrifice that Paul talks about in Romans 12? That everything that you have remaining now with you, that you have in this life, that you are willing to give it up for His sake, for eternity. Will you be prudent? Will you be as shrewd as the people of this world that understand their situation and they prepare for their earthly future, which is going to be dust? Will you prepare yourself for that imperishable wreath, that treasure that awaits for you in heaven? Pray with me. Father, thank you. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the stories that we hear in your word. Thank you for all the stories that are here in this room right now and how you weave us all together. And Father, may we leave now this place even more committed to building your kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. Through Christ we pray. Amen.